Welcome back for those of you who happily sat through the morning presentations. And for those of you who perhaps couldn't make it this morning, who are here the first time, maybe one or two, welcome. The presentation, as Rick Lowe was just mentioning for today, is Why Socialism Failed, the Ethical and Economic Bankruptcy of the Planned Society. Someone had asked me during the lunch break, what do I mean in that title, the Planned Society? And just as a preface, the Planned Society means a society in which government imposes a plan, a central plan, on the economic activities and development of the society. It's not you making your own plans, it's not me making my own plans, and then us interacting in the marketplace and sort of trying to make our individual plans compatible with each other. It's the government superimposing one plan on everyone in the society. That's what's meant by that, okay? All righty. Now, before we talk about the planned society or the command economy, I want to sort of remind us it's opposite, and that is the institutions of a free market economy. In other words, to see the contrast between a planned economy and the market economy. The institutions of a free market economy. All means of production, land, resources, capital, are privately owned. The use of the means of production are under the control of private individuals, private owners, who may be either individuals or corporate entities, companies. Consumer demands determine how the means of production will be used. Competitive forces of supply and demand. Let me first go back. As we talked about earlier, consumers want products. Since the producers can't force you to buy their products, if they want to make revenues and profits, they must direct their use of the means of production, land, labor, capital, and so on, under their control or ownership, to make the products that you'd be willing to buy, interested in buying, for them to generate the revenue and profits they hope to have. So that's what is meant by consumer demands determine how the means of production will be used. Competitive forces of supply and demand determine the prices of consumer goods and the various factors of production, including the wages of labor. The failure, or the success or failure of individual or corporate enterprises is determined by the profits and losses those enterprises earn in free competition with their rivals in the marketplace. In addition, the free market is not confined to domestic transaction, but includes freedom of international trade as well. And in that setting, then, what is the function, the role, the activities of the government? We talked a little bit about that in one of the morning lectures. Government is limited in its activities to the enforcement, protection of life, liberty, and property against violence and fraud. Now, why do we want such an open system? And again, harking back to what we were discussing in the second lecture before the lunch break, to quote from Friedrich Hayek, a famous Nobel laureate economist, from his book, The Constitution of Liberty, liberty is essential in order to leave room for the unforeseeable and the unpredictable. We want it because we have learned to expect from it the opportunity of realizing many of our aims. It is because every individual knows so little. Listen to that. It is because every individual knows so little. And in particular, because we rarely know which of us knows best, that we trust the independent and competitive efforts of many to induce the emergence of what we shall want when we see it. Okay? So in other words, one of the reasons we want freedom is precisely because of our individual human ignorance, of not knowing who knows better, who can do something more effectively, who could come up with the new idea. We want, as we saw earlier, to allow the market to be a competitive discovery process, precisely because of our individual limited and imperfect knowledge. Now, what is a command economy? The planning and directing of the participants in the division of labor is undertaken and controlled by a central planning authority. The central planning authority issues commands to the members of society, assigning each to his place, position, and responsibilities for work within the system of division of labor. The central planning authority decides what shall be produced and how it shall be produced and where and when and by whom. Now, the ancient world system of government control and planning was based on slavery. It could have been a conquering tribe, it could have been a king, but the fact is that those that the victorious tribe or gang defeated, those who were not killed by the victorious tribe or king, were taken into enslavement. If you weren't killed, you were enslaved. And why? To get you to do work that the conqueror or the winner of the war either could not do himself or did not want to have to do himself. Now, the political structure of a centrally planned economy, in principle, in theory, can be totalitarian, oligarchic, or democratic. That is, the political authority can be either dictatorial or popularly elected. In practice, however, just in history, almost every centrally planned economy has been either dictatorial, that is, non or anti-democratic, from the start, or over time has successfully moved in that direction. That is, from a democracy to various forms of dictatorship. Now, in the 20th century, there have been particular instances of the command or controlled or planned societies. The most stark instances, obviously in the last 100 years, were communism and fascism, or German National Socialism. As I say here, under communism, the state owns and controls all of the means of production. The government owns the factories, owns the land, owns the resources, is the only employer. You either work for the government or you work for nobody, right? The ultimate monopoly. And the government then directs how the resources will be used, for what purpose. The government decides what will be produced, where it will be produced, when it will be produced, in what quantities, with what qualities, with the assigned task of people to undertake those jobs. Now, in the Soviet Union, this was called Gosplan. That was just the initials of a long Russian name, which basically meant the government central planning agency. Now, the fascist or National Socialist or Nazi version was just a slight variation on that theme. As I say here, the state controls but does not own the major portion of the means of production. In fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, each sector of the economy, instead of being directly owned by the government, was unified into government-mandated cartels to which every business enterprise had to belong. All workers were required to belong to government-controlled labor unions. And government central planning agencies directed what businesses were to produce and what quantities, to whom they were to sell their output, and at what prices and what wages workers were to be paid. So businessmen were reduced to managers obeying the instructions of the government planning agencies. But that was the only difference between communism and fascist or Nazi systems. Did the government directly own the means of production and directly command and control and direct? Or did property remain, for the most part, nominally, that is on paper, in private hands, but the government told everybody what they could do with their property? Well, if the government's telling you what to do with your property, then it's really, in the practical, everyday sense, it's no longer your property. Now, what was the human cost of these attempts to build these either communist forms of socialism or fascist National Socialist forms of socialism? Here is the human cost of the 20th century. Death by government in the 20th century. Collectivist or command political systems, civilian deaths. This is not war. This is unarmed men, women, and children. Civilian deaths by governments. Execution, death under torture, government-created famines, slave labor, worked to death. The greatest number has been in communist China, the People's Republic of China under Chairman Mao. 1949, from the time the communists came to power on the Chinese mainland, to 1976 when Mao died. Now, China is still a communist country. It's controlled by the Communist Party. Obviously, their bureaucratic records in general, and as also the Chinese version of a secret police, are all closed. But to the best extent that Chinese historians and Western historians can estimate, from the extent to some information and records have been made available since Mao's death and just internal research on their own, it is estimated that 80 million people, that is 80 million people, were killed by Mao's regime in the name of building a new Chinese socialist man. 80 million. The Soviet Union, Lenin, Stalin, and after 1917, from the time of the Bolshevik Revolution to 1991, when the Soviet Union as a political entity on the world map disappeared, it's estimated that 68 million people. In 1929, 1930, the communist dictator Stalin, who followed Lenin after Lenin's death in the 1920s, he decided that all forms of private enterprise that still remained in Russia were going to be ended. So all remaining small businesses were taken over by the government, and all land was taken out of private farming hands, what was called collectivization. A large part of the population of Russia at that time were still rural populations, peasants, if you will. And they owned their own little private farms. And these people had, generations of their little farms. They didn't want to give up their farms to the government. They resisted. They tried to prevent this. So Stalin decided to force them into submission. And as a consequence of this, their food was confiscated, so they'd have nothing to eat. So you're going to force them through starvation. They would be rounded up and arrested and sent to Siberia or the deserts of Soviet Central Asia. Now, these records are open since the end of the Soviet Union, and Russian and Western historians have estimated that in the forced collectivization of the land, that is, the government forcibly taking over the land between 1929 and 1932-33, in this drive to end private farming, the Soviet regime, either direct killing or death by government-created famine. You take all the food and the seeds out of the people's hands and then put a ring over this area, preventing anyone from bringing food in, right, to starve the people into submission. That it is estimated that somewhere in the neighborhood of between 9 and 12 million people were killed. Alone, just in taking over the land from people. At the height of the slave labor camps in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, 40s, and into the early 50s, it is estimated that at any one time there was somewhere between 20 and 25 million people in the forced labor camps through the Soviet Union, working at personal life-threatening risk in uranium mines, platinum mines, sent to construct absurd towns, industrial towns, way up in the Arctic Circle, where people will work to death by starvation and exhaustion. And don't worry, they're dead. You just replace them with more, round them up. Anyone who they could rationalize was an enemy of the people, an enemy of the state, was fair game to be rounded up for slave labor. National Socialist or Nazi Germany under Hitler, 1933 to 1945, obviously the end of the Second World War when the Germans lost. Again, this is not the wartime deaths in Europe, right? Soldiers fighting each other. No. These are unarmed civilian men, women, and children killed by the Nazi regime. It's estimated 25 million. 6 million Jews, 3 million Poles, at least 500,000 to 750,000 Gypsies, over 10 million Russians and Ukrainians, and then smatterings of a bunch of other people throughout the rest of Europe in countries that were occupied at one time or another by the German army. Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek, this was the Kuomintang, or the nationalist government that was in power just before Mao came to power. They killed over 10 million. Imperial Japan, 1936 to 1945, right? That's from the time that the Japanese invaded China to the Japanese defeat in the Second World War. Also 10 million. One of the worst, famous atrocities from this was what was called the Rape of Nanking. Not Beijing, but Nanking, along the Yangtze River, was before the Second World War the capital of China. And when the Japanese occupied Shanghai and then went up the Yangtze River, they occupied the Kuomintang, or nationalist Chinese capital of Nanking. And they proceeded to kill, it's estimated, somewhere between 250 to 300,000 men, women, and children just for sport in the occupation of the city. Raping women from the age of 4 or 5 years old to their 80s and 90s. Taking men, tying them to poles and using them for live bayonet practice. I mean, the brutality was unimaginable. And then finally, I'm throwing one more in. Cambodia under Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. That's just French for the red Cambodians, right? Khmer Rouge. And they were in power from 1975 to 1979, 3 years. And they killed an estimated 2 million people. Now, you're probably saying, wait a second, why am I putting them there? 80 million, 68 million, 25 million, 10 million. Why too many? That's like the miscellaneous column. You won't even miss them. Why am I throwing in them? Because as a percentage of a population, right? Not an absolute number, but a percentage of a population. This was probably one of the worst mass murders by a government in the 20th century. Why? The entire population of Cambodia was 6 million. That means they killed, in 3 years, 1 out of every 3 people. 1, 2, 3, you're dead. 1, 2, 3, you're dead. 1, 2, 3, you're dead. There's actually a movie about this, based upon the story of a Cambodian newspaperman who had worked with the New York Times. But when the Khmer Rouge took over, obviously the New York Times and all the other foreign correspondents had to leave, and this guy just missed having his New York Times colleague helping him get out of the country. So he got stuck there, this Cambodian journalist. And he went through their slave labor system and survived, and then escaped eventually across the border into neighboring Thailand. And he got to the US, his New York Times colleague found out that he'd escaped and helped come to the United States as a political refugee. And then he wrote a book, it's called The Killing Fields, which was made into a movie. It's not a happy movie, it's not a happy movie, but bad things have happened in human history. Human beings have done bad things to other human beings. And if you want to have a sense of what that experience in modern history was, right, 1970s is not that long ago, you can either read his book or see the movie. They would kill a large number of people who they viewed as enemies of the regime, and they would then take their bodies and boil the flesh off the bodies in acid, leaving nothing but the skeleton. They would then take the skulls and make little like pyramid mounds and leave them along the roads as warnings to others, not to challenge the regime. Total civilian killings by all governments in the 20th century are estimated as about 250 million men, women, and children. Now, as I like to tell my American students, the entire population of the United States is about 315 million now, right? The US Census Bureau estimates about 315 million. That means that a little less, that would be equivalent to killing about 5 out of every 6 people in the United States. Okay, that would be equivalent. That would be like killing 5 out of every 6 people in the United States. That's what governments have done in the name of building a communist utopia, a Nazi racial utopia, just killing people like the Japanese did to imperialistically try to grab another country. That's what collectivist command economies in practice have done to their fellow human beings in the pursuit of utopia, a new socialist man of one type or another. In the 19th century, the socialist idea emerged. It began first in the sense that we normally think of socialism among British and French thinkers. Karl Marx, who's usually considered the great social proponent of socialism, the inspiration for Russian or Soviet type communism, he got most of his ideas from French people. He was a writer. He got kicked out of Germany, where he was born, because the government didn't like his editorials in some newspapers. He then went to Brussels. The German government put pressure on the Belgian government, so he went to Paris. And it was in Paris that he met all of these French socialists and read their works and interacted with them. And that's actually what made Karl Marx a socialist. Before that, he was an anti-communist. You can read some works of opinion pieces in a German newspaper from 1842, in which he's saying communism is not only impractical, but morally would not be desired. Now that's the Karl Marx I like. This is the Karl Marx who says communism is bad. I can live with that kind of Karl Marx. But anyway, so he was influenced by these French socialists, not exclusively, but then he took that and of philosophical ideas he had learned as a student at the University of Berlin, much younger, and he developed what we call Marxism, the Marxian version of socialism. But in the 19th century, the goal of almost all socialists, including Marx, was the abolition of private property and the means of production. In its place, the means of production were to be nationalized, taken over by a new socialist revolutionary governments that would then centrally plan all economic activity. However, very few advocates of socialism attempted to explain how a system of central planning would work. In other words, now that the government has nationalized all the means of production, owns them, controls them, from a central bureaucracy, decides how the resources are going to be allocated, what they'll be used for, who's going to do the producing, what's going to be manufactured, how much, and how is it going to be distributed in the society. What was not really answered was how would the government decide what to produce, where to produce, with what combination of land, labor, resources, and capital to produce, how much to produce, and how to distribute it. Marx even considered asking how a socialist economy would function was to be unscientific. The future will take care of itself. Only in one place, in a work that Marx wrote in 1875 called Critique of the Gotha Program. This was Marx's critique of another socialist group that he disagreed with. Does he even mention? Basically, he says the socialist government will maintain and expand the productive capacity of society through capital investment. How? He doesn't explain. And then he says the welfare state. Marx wants the welfare state, right? It will manage a welfare state with government retirement and health insurance, government education, and the administration of government planning and direction of production. But that is practically all that Marx says about the socialist system, other than when production capacity will have grown so much that scarcity will no longer exist, right? The means will be greater than the ends, so everything will be free in any conceivable abundance we wanted. Then we will be in a post-scarce society, and we'll have what that famous phrase, in a higher phase of communist society, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. You know, a little happy paradise where you have no more work to do. Now, there was the Bolshevik Revolution in 1970 under Vladimir Lenin. The imperial, that is the Tsarist government of Russia, had been weakened by the war. The Tsar had to abdicate, that is, give up the throne, not to the communists, but to a democratic left-of-center coalition of parties in February of 1917. And it was that government that was then overthrown by Lenin and the communists. So Lenin and the communists were not overthrowing the evil dictatorial czar. They ended up overthrowing a democratic, admittedly left-of-center government. From that point, Russia was under communist control until the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. In 1918, during the Russian Civil War, between Lenin's communists and a variety of anti-socialist armies, that civil war went on for about 3.5 years, resulting in the death of around 8 to 10 million people. Lenin introduced what he called war communism, that was meant to be a great leap forward into a radical socialism through nationalization of industry, agriculture, the abolition of money transactions, and the establishment of that government bureaucratic directed central planning. And in 1919, there were attempts to establish communist regimes in Hungary and in the German southern region of Bavaria. By the way, that's a poster, a communist poster from Russia at this time. You can't see it. Lenin is on the globe with a broom, and he's brushing away the Tsar. He's brushing away priests, right? Religion is evil under the communists. And he's brushing away evil, greedy, profit-seeking capitalists. Brushing away to make a new world. Now, how is this new socialist economy to work? Fine, the government's taken over the means of production. Nothing is in private hands of any significance anymore. The government is going to centrally direct and decide what gets produced, how, where, when, so on, through bureaucratic command decision-making. So how will you know what to make? Because you're claiming that socialism is going to give an economic paradise, better goods, more goods, a bountifulness of goods where there'll no longer be poverty or scarcity. So how are you going to know what to produce? And for what purposes? That failure of the socialist advocates and practitioners to explain how a socialist economy in the real world would work and work better than a functioning market economy, that was then challenged by an Austrian economist named Ludwig von Mises. There's a picture of him. In 1920, Ludwig von Mises published an article called Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, which he then expanded into a full book about every conceivable facet of socialism, which was published in 1922. He argued basically that a rational and efficient use of the society's scarce means of production, land, labor, resources, capital, required the institutions of a market economy. It needed private property and consumer goods, and the means of production. It needed market competition and market-generated prices. It needs prices for consumer goods because this provides essential information about what goods consumers want and the relative values they place upon it, right? You value a car more than a pair of shoes. Prices for the factors of production provide essential information for entrepreneurs about the opportunity costs of land, labor, resources, and capital in alternative uses. You're not the only businessman who wants to use resources to make things. There's other competing businessmen. You're making shoes, he's going to make clothes. This person's going to make overhead projectors. The other person is going to make recessed fluorescent lights. Another person is going to make cell phones. Well, we have all these competing uses for the resources out of which to make these products. Well, how do you know what these resources are worth, that they're more valuable in making product A instead of product B? Mises argued you need prices for that as well. These prices make it possible for entrepreneurs and businessmen to undertake what he called economic calculation, to determine what might be the most rational and efficient use of those factors of production in estimating what would be profit-making and to avoid what would be loss-making as best as you can make these estimates. As he says here, capitalist economic calculation, which alone makes rational production possible, is based on monetary calculation. In the capitalist system, the calculation of profitability constitutes a guide that indicates to the individual whether the enterprise he is operating is being run in the most efficient way, that is, in the least cost in factors of production. And Mises's argument basically ran like this. With no private property, there is, at least legally, of course people could be stealing and then black market trading, but with no private property, there's legally nothing to buy and sell. With nothing to buy and sell, there are no potential mutual gains from trade, right? Well, if I give you a hat, you'll give me a pair of shoes, but there's no private hats and shoes in terms of manufacturing. With nothing to buy and sell, there are no potential mutual gains from trade. With no potential mutual gains from trade, there are no incentives for people to make bids and offers for goods and services. With no bids and offers, there can be no bargaining to establish agreed upon terms of trade. But with no agreed upon terms of trade, then there's no agreed upon prices. 2 pair of shoes for 1 set of clothes. And with no market prices, there is no way of knowing what goods consumers really want or what might be the most cost-efficient use of resources and which lines of production would be profit-making versus loss-making. Hence, socialism in practice, through government central planning, does away with all the economic rationality because it does away with any real and usable methods for economic calculation. Why? Because it abolishes the market-based and market-generated competitive price system, by which and through which we know what people want and the value they place upon goods, what are the alternative uses other businessmen have for resources, and what value they place upon them in making product X instead of product Y. Mises's conclusion, therefore, was that socialist central planning would not create a world of economic prosperity. Instead, socialist planning would produce what he called, as the title of another little book he wrote later on, planned chaos. Now, I traveled in the Soviet Union. I did consulting work in the Soviet Union in the last years of the Soviet Union. I was there consulting on market reform and privatization. Well, the system is dying. How do you put in its place a functioning market economy? But I was traveling around Moscow and other parts of the Soviet Union. The stores were empty. The products were shoddy. The supplies did not in any way match the demands. There is a large department store complex opposite the Kremlin on the other side of Red Square in Moscow. Now today, in the post-communist era, every conceivable boutique and high-end retail fashionable store has outlets there. Everything is there. But back in the old communist days, this was a department store complex run by the government. There was no private, it was all government stores. Now, the GUM store is sort of like U-shaped. Okay? And it has 3 levels. Okay, so you have level 1 and level 2 and level 3. Okay, so it's like 3 levels in a U-shaped. So I'm walking around there, interested to see, seeing, this store is practically empty. These products and merchandise, you wouldn't give as a gift to your worst enemy in terms of the quality of them. And so I'm standing on the top level, right, the third level over here, and I'm looking across the U. And I notice that on the second level, over here, there's a long line. What's in this store? There's a long, it's the only one with a long line. And it's only women online. So I go down to get closer to see. It's women's underwear. Only one problem, comrade. One size fits all. Okay? Too big, use people's safety pin. One size fits all. Okay? That was it. That was it. That's not to have unnecessary and wasteful capitalist multiple productions of goods. One essential type for everybody. And that's how the entire society and economy was run. Now, we take for granted, oh, it's time to go food shopping. I'm going to go to the supermarket. You take your little card and you go around the aisles, 2 cans of peas, 3 loaves of bread, some milk, right? Then you go to the checkout counter, right? We take that for granted. Ah, comrade, in people's socialism, not that way. Every retail store is different. Okay, want to have a loaf of bread? Go into people's bread store. What you do, you get online. And you wait and wait online. And get to bread counter. Tell lady behind counter, want 1 pumpernickel, 1 rye. Now you think you're leaving, right? Forget it. She gives you a little ticket. And with this ticket you go to a second line. And you wait. And you wait. And what you waiting for, comrade? To get to register to pay for the loaves of bread you want. Now after waiting, you get receipt for having paid. You know what you do now? Get on third line. And wait and wait to turn in receipt to get bread you want, assuming by this time there's any left. So now you have your little basket of your bag of bread. But as the phrase goes, man does not live by bread alone. Okay? Maybe you want some dairy products, right? You want a quart of milk, you want some butter to put on the bread. Now you walk to the people's dairy store. Not necessarily next door, comrade. It's winter in Moscow. So you have your little bag of bread and walking through storm of snow to get to people's dairy store. So now you get to the dairy store. You got it. Line 1, line 2, line 3. So now, comrade, 1 hand bag bread, 1 hand milk and butter. Want meat to put on bread with butter. Go to people's meat store. Not next door, walking through snow. And so now you get to the meat store, and you got it, line 1, line 2, line 3. That is how everything worked in the Soviet Union. Everything worked. Oh, they're out of something, or the quality seems bad? What do you do about that? Oh, you better have connections. You know someone who works in the shoe store. And you go through the back door and pay a bribe to get the actual pair of shoes you want. The corruption, the inefficiency, the deadly draining of time and human energy to live and survive in that system is something that unless you've seen it, you have no idea about it. I was there enough times, and I wait online. I staying in friend's apartment, usually illegally because you had to have permit to where you lived. The authorities only want you to live where they want you to live, so they can be watching you as a foreigner, comrade. But yeah, I had to do that line stuff. But that was the reality of how people lived. But this was Mises's argument as to why, just in economics, forget about the mass murderers, that these were dictators and tyrants who brutalized people in the society. Even if they were angels who only cared about their fellow man and wanted to do only good, institutionally, They had done away with the market institutions, without which you can't make reasonable judgments as to rationally know how to use your scarce resources to make things people really want, based upon the value of what people place upon things. And therefore, it inevitably was dysfunctional, right? It was a dysfunctional economic system. Now, Mises's argument was elaborated on by Friedrich Hayek, this fellow I've quoted before. Oh my gosh, who's there with Friedrich Hayek? Oh my God, I was young then, so young. I almost looked lifelike there. Anyway, yeah, I often tell people, notice, he's turned away and covered his ear. Oh, not that Ebeling guy again, please, no, not that Ebeling guy again. But anyway, in 1945, Hayek wrote a famous article, which is one of the reasons why he was considered to be deserving of a Nobel Prize in economics, which he was awarded in 1974. Hayek argued that matching the division of labor is a division of knowledge. The very idea of specialization in the division of labor means that some people know things that others do not. Now, we all kind of commonsensically know this, right? If there's a division of labor, there's the butcher, there's the baker, there's the candlestick maker. And obviously the butcher knows how to cut meat, the baker knows how to bake a loaf of bread, the candlestick maker knows how to, turn wax into a candle. But Hayek's point was more than that there are different types of related and interdependent forms of knowledge. There are three types of knowledge, he suggested. First of all, there's textbook or scientific knowledge, the type of formal knowledge that may be acquired through systematic study and reading. That's what you're doing here at the college as students. You're assigned a textbook, supplementary readings, you have to learn the material, you have to pass an exam, right? That's scientific or textbook knowledge. Now, this is invaluable knowledge. This is important knowledge. Don't you want a doctor to have had textbook knowledge if you go to him for medical treatment? Yeah, he better know that the knee bone is connected to the shin bone. Okay, that's useful. That's an old song. It's an old song. Even before my time, so don't think it's just before your time. Okay, so anyway, a lawyer, if you need to go to court, don't you want a lawyer who knows the case law, who knows how to write a brief and submit it to the court, who knows how to defend you before a jury? I mean, obviously, and that takes years of textbook study. That's valuable and essential bits of information. But Hayek's point is that that's not the only kind of knowledge in society. Another one is what he called particular local knowledge of time and place in a specific corner of society in the division of labor. What does he mean by that? You're going to graduate. Well, hopefully. You'll graduate, and you're going to have your first, entry-level job. So now it's your first day on the job. And as you come to work that day, the big boss comes up to you and says, "Young man or young lady, here's this report. I need 30 copies in half an hour for a meeting I'm having with my staff. Up to it." The big boss, he notices you on the first day. "Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir." Oh. So now but where the hell's the photocopy machine? Located in some room. You put in the paper. You push out how many copies you need. You push the start button, and guess what? Nothing happens. It doesn't work. You're panicking. "Oh, that's time. Oh, the big boss. Oh, I can't take. Oh, my first day is going to be my last." You're panicking, right? You laugh. It's going to happen to you. Anyway, so now some other guy comes up and says, "What's wrong?" "Oh, put the pen." You have to know what to do. He kicks the side of the photocopy machine, and suddenly the guy chunks out all the copies. Now, is there anything that you will have learned in any of your textbooks here at the College of the Bahamas that will in any way inform you that in this particular business, at this particular moment in time, there's some type of electrical short in that photocopy machine, but that if you kick it in the right place, the contact is made so it starts working at least temporarily? No! Nothing in your learning class is going to give you that information. That's localized knowledge of time and place. It sounds trivial, but if you got to get something done at a particular moment, isn't it useful to know that? Particularly if it's your first day, and you better do it or the big boss is going to fire you your first day. But that's not the only kind of localized knowledge that Hayek is talking about. That is practical knowledge to just keep everything properly working. You get your job, you move up, someday may become a manager of a department or a branch of the business. You're overseeing, you're supervising people. Joe, who does something essential in the company, calls in sick. And it's not phony. He's really down with the flu. He can't lift his head off the pillow. He's out for 3 or 4 days. You can't stop your business just because Joe is out sick, given what he does inside the firm. You have customers that who you've contracted to fulfill certain deliveries. You have to keep production moving along. So who's going to replace Joe, at least while he's out sick? Well, there's Bob there. Now, Bob really doesn't do Joe's job, but he's worked with Joe enough times that he kind of, at least temporarily for a few days, can fill in. But if Bob is filling in for Joe, who now covers for part of Bob's job that Bob isn't going to be able to do because he's covering for Joe out sick? Well, you see, you have to know the personal qualities, the expertise, the knowledge, the abilities of everybody on your staff. Now, we talk about another thing. You're taking business classes. Some of you have taken some basic economics. Market demand. What's the purpose of business enterprise? To satisfy the consumer to earn a profit. Who the hell are these consumers? There's no such thing as the consumers. There's the consumers for markers. There's the consumers for ties. There's the consumers for eyeglasses. There's the consumers for shoes. There's the consumers for recessed lights. There's consumers for laptop computers, for drinks, and on and on and on. How do you know what these specific consumers want? What might be changes in their tastes and preferences? What qualities and characteristics they're looking for in the goods that you could manufacture and sell to them to earn those profits that you hope for? You have to interact with these people. You have to know them. And by the way, it's not just the demand side, it's the supply side too, right? You have competitors. Well, what if I introduce a new line or open a new branch store someplace or start a new advertising campaign or put something on sale? How will my rivals act? Don't you have to take into consideration the responses of your rivals in planning your own strategies? You're taking business courses, you hear about that too. This is all localized knowledge of time and place that is essential so that people in their own little corner of the world can take advantage of their knowledge, circumstances, reading of the situation. Do people always get it right? Of course not. We're imperfect people with imperfect knowledge, and we make mistakes and errors. That's being human. But the point is that the person on the spot is more likely to have a nuanced understanding of the circumstances and how and what to do, and will have the strongest motive to try to get it right rather than not, because he's going to bear the losses if it turns out to be wrong and the profits are not earned. Or he won't get the promotion that doing a good job could have gotten him. Right? Again, inducing self-interest to try to read the tea leaves as best you can. And finally, Hayek talked about what he called tacit or inarticulate knowledge. The knowledge of what to do, how to do, where to do, and when to do something, but which is difficult or impossible to fully put into spoken or written words. What the hell does that mean? How many of you know how to ride a bicycle? Now, this is not a trick question. It's not on a test, so don't get nervous here. Okay, so, when did you learn approximately, what age did you learn how to ride a bike? 10? Who was younger? How old were you? About 6 years old. Okay, so now you're 10 or 6 years old. Did your mom or dad say, oh, you want to ride a bike? Well, here's the how to ride a bike manual. Go out and play in the traffic. No. Chances are, maybe you started with the little tricycle. And then you had the two-wheeler, but maybe the training wheels, right? Sometimes the training wheels. But now it's the big day. Okay, it's the big day. The training wheels are going to come off. Either mom or dad or maybe a brother or sister or somebody, they went out and they're running along with you. Now try to balance yourself on the seat. And this is how you turn and move the handlebar. You know, if you feel yourself falling one way or the other. You have to pedal so fast and everything. And now they let go. You're on your own. What happened the first time? Don't lie. You fell down. Oh, I bruised, mommy, kiss it. Oh. Okay, you fell down. Now, but what did you do? What does the old song say? You pick yourself up, you dust yourself off, and you start all over again. Okay? So you got up and you did it again and again until finally you figured out how to do it, right? You didn't learn it from a manual. Now, someday, you might have kids, and they're going to want to ride a bike. And you'd prefer that they ride a bike successfully than falling down, because do you want to kiss their dirty knee? Of course you don't. Fall down, you have to kiss their dirty knee, make it better, mommy or daddy. Okay, so But how do we put these into words? There's many things that we learn how to do, but if we had to put it into a written or spoken form of language, we'd find it very difficult to articulate it. Years and years and years ago, I was watching television, one of those daytime talk shows, and he had a guest on who was kind of talking about the kind of knowledge I'm explaining here. And he had two people come up from the audience. He had one lie on the stage and the other stand over him. And he said to the person lying on the stage, I want you to get up, but you're only going to get up from the actual literal verbal instructions that this other fellow is going to give you. Now you tell him how to get up, and you give him as precise, exact instructions as you can, and you only do what he says. Well, if you ever watch these talk shows on TV, well, between commercials, where you get like about a 7-minute segment and then it's the next commercial. So for 7 minutes, this guy's giving this guy instructions. He never got up off the floor. Is there anyone here who doesn't know how to get up off the floor? I'm not saying you've been drunk. Forget that. We're ignoring that, remember? I don't want to talk about that. Don't believe anything you hear. Okay. But all of us know how to get up the floor. How do you put that into words? Because the guy was saying, now bend your knees, put your elbows on the stage, tighten your stomach muscles and pivot. Now, in one sense, the anatomist, the medical doctor who specializes in the neurological and muscular aspects of the human body, they probably could put a paper or a little booklet together, how to get up off the floor. But it's not really how any of us know how to get up off the floor. We just know how to do it. Okay, there's an immense amount of things that we just do, we don't even know how to do it. And I'll just do one more example. Your car is giving you trouble, and you're not really, into auto mechanics. So you take it to the mechanic at the gas station. So he tells you to turn on the engine, he opens the hood. Oh, we're in a British former colony, the bonnet. The bonnet. So he opens the hood bonnet, and so you step outside, and you're standing next to him, and he's listening to the engine, and he says, come back in about an hour and a half, I'll have it fixed, no problem, it's going to run like new. You say, well, what's wrong with it? Oh, no, I hear it. I've heard that, I know that kind of sound, I know exactly what the problem is. Yeah, but what's the problem? I worked on these cars for years, just trust me. Now, he may know exactly what to do. And is it important that we have found someone who knows how to fix it? Because certainly we prefer our car running right rather than wrong. But he might himself not be able to put it into actual words. He just hears something that you're listening, you don't hear a damn thing. That's important knowledge of everyday activity too, is it not? Of course. Now, Hayek emphasized that we have all three of these types of knowledge. Different types, different combinations. They're always being added to and changing through our life experiences every day. But all of us have these different kinds of knowledge. This is the knowledge of the world. This is the knowledge of the world. Okay? When I talk to my American students, and I'm talking about this, I say, if someone asks you, where is all the knowledge of the world? One answer could be in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., supposedly one of the biggest libraries in the entire world. All books on every subject, old books, new books, miles of bookshelves of tens of millions of books on every conceivable subject. Natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, fiction, everything. And you could say all the knowledge of the world resides in the Library of Congress. But do you know something? It does not reside in any one book. The knowledge is divided into a little bit in this book, a little bit in this book, a little bit in this book. Oh, you mean like the knowledge of the world is divided up into our minds. You have a little bit of the knowledge of the world. You do, you do, you do. Even Rick Lowe back there does, I know. Even Rick. Okay, all of us have this. No one of us has all the knowledge of the world. The knowledge of the world is dispersed, decentralized, spread out in small amounts in all of our minds. Well, if that's where the knowledge of the world is, and we would like to benefit, gain from what others know that we don't, how do we bring together, integrate and coordinate all of this dispersed and decentralized knowledge of many different types so each of us can benefit from it? That's what Hayek said is crucial in the price system. Hayek argued that for all of these different types of knowledge to be effectively and effectively used, the individuals possessing this knowledge must be free to use and apply the knowledge they possess, since no one else has this knowledge and no one can judge how best to use it other than the individuals themselves. There must be a means, a method by which and through which all those individuals can communicate with each other. being separated from each other by time and space. People need to communicate with each other in their role as consumers, so producers can know what goods they are interested in buying and the relative values they place on them. In their role as producers, they must be able to determine what consumers want them to produce and how best to produce it, given the opportunity costs of the factors of production, that is, the values of resources, labor, land capital, and alternative production uses. Hayek's answer was to explain and emphasize that the purpose and function of a competitive price system was to solve this problem. Market-generated prices can and do serve as the communications mechanism through which all the members of a society are able to inform each other about their demands as consumers and their potential supplies as producers. And among competing producers, market prices capture the relative values those entrepreneurs place on the factors of production for the use of which they are in competition with each other. Now, notice I use a phrase here, separated by time and space. Now, space is obvious, right? Some people are living in Iowa, in the United States, growing wheat, and someone down here is catching fish, and so we're separated from each other by space. But what does time mean? The bread that we buy today in the supermarket comes from wheat that was harvested months ago and that had been planted in the ground at least a year earlier. What has to be anticipated correctly is not just what you might want today that could be supplied today. All production is time forward-looking. The farmer has to anticipate what we will want to eat a year from now or longer and direct his productions with an anticipation of our future wants, so that when we want a loaf of bread, the seed was already planted, it was always taken care of in the ground, it was harvested months earlier, ground into the necessary forms to then be baked into the bread that we buy at the store. So we're separated from each other by both space and time. And it is through prices that people try to make those best guesses as to what people want and when, and to be planning ahead, with each individual having the latitude, the liberty in a competitive free market to use their knowledge as best they think they can apply it, as they find their niche, their role, their place in this now global division of labor. Market-based prices enable the communication of a great amount of information that each needs in their own activities in the division of labor, to assure a tendency, as I said, toward an integration and a coordination of what everyone in the society is doing in their corner of the world, while at the same time leaving each individual free to use his own knowledge and abilities as they think best, and about which only each individual can fully know and appreciate, because other people don't have your perspective that you do in your corner of the world. Without these market-based prices as a tool for economic calculation, it would be impossible for governments to share, for individuals to share with each other all the other information that is essential for successful cooperation and coordination in what is now a global division of labor. Government socialist central planners can never know, can never learn, can never effectively use all the decentralized and dispersed bits of knowledge that only exist in the minds of the different members of this now global community of production, trade, and competition. There is more knowledge and different types of knowledge in the minds of all the individual people in the world than any group of central planners could ever successfully master and understand and use in a way better, that is more economically efficient, than allowing each individual to use his own knowledge as he considers best, while being guided by those competitive market prices as to where to apply himself and for what. As Ludwig von Mises said already in 1931, when planning was emerging as the great ideal, government planning, the great ideal of the future, insomuch as money prices of the means of production can be determined only in a social order in which they are privately owned, the proof of the impracticability of socialism necessarily follows. It alone will enable future historians to understand how it came about that the victory of the socialist movement did not lead to the creation of the socialist order of society, because wishing does not make it so. Now, there's another element about this that I wanted to take a minute to talk about, and that is the hubris of the social engineer, the economic planner in society. Adam Smith spoke about this even before he wrote The Wealth of Nations. This was his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, 1759, in a very famous passage. This is the social engineer, is the man who wants to plan society, to direct everyone, to reshape everything according to his own dictates and conception of the good, right, and just. whether other people in society want it or not. The man of system, that's what he means by the social engineer, the government economic planner. The man of system is apt to be very wise in his own conceit, and is often so enamored with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it. He goes on to establish it completely in all of its parts, without any regard whether either to the great interests or to the strongest prejudices which may oppose it. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. He does not consider that the pieces upon the chessboard have no other principle of motion besides that which the hand impresses upon them. But in that great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislature might choose to impress on it. If these two principles coincide and act in the same direction, then the game of human society will go on easily and harmoniously, and is very likely to be happy and successful. If they are opposite or different, the game will go on miserably, and the society must be at all times in the highest degree of disorder. To insist upon establishing all at once, and in spite of all opposition, everything which the idea may seem to require, must often be of the highest degree of arrogance. And it is to erect his own judgment into the supreme standard of right and wrong. It is to fancy himself the only wise and worthy man in the Commonwealth, and that his fellow citizens should accommodate themselves to him, and not he to them. Okay? What Smith is saying is here is that on this great chessboard of society, the planner, the government regulator, the government commander, they want to position all of us on the chessboard as if we're these inanimate little pawns, forgetting that each of us, those living pawns, have a will, a purpose, a dream, a hope, a desire of our own. We want to decide our own position on the great chessboard of society. We want to form our own relationships and associations and patterns with others, not to have a pattern and a set of relationships imposed upon us from the top down. It is supreme arrogance, hubris, for those in government to presume that they know how we should run our lives, arrange our lives, associate with others better than we ourselves. Let's suppose that I came along and said, I know how you should live. I know who you should marry. I know what kind of education you should get. I know what kind of job you should have. I know the kind of clothes you should wear. I know who you should have as friends. How will you react to that if I said those things to you? You'd say, who the hell are you? You don't know the first thing about me, and besides, I prefer to make these choices myself. Why should we assume that if you consider it arrogant and hubris and absurd for me to do it as a private individual, that just because this guy says, I'm in charge of the government department, I was elected to public office, that it's any more arrogant and hubris-like when they want to do it to all of us? Who the hell made them God? and to presume that they know how to do it. I always have this image that, to be like the fly on the wall. If I could be like the fly on the wall in some government office in Washington, D.C., where it's like the head of some government department, and the phone rings, and he answers the phone, and it's his wife on the other end. You forgot to pick up the dry cleaning yesterday. Don't forget it today on the way home. And you better not forget Johnny's soccer game. You were late last time. This guy can't even remember to get the dry cleaning, and he's telling us how to run our lives? Give me a break! But this is the mindset. They're just like us. They get up in the morning, they put on their clothes, they have a cup of coffee, and they argue with their husband or wife, and they forget to take out the dog and then have to clean up after it. Okay? They're just like you and me. They're not gods. I am the prime minister. I am the president. Give me a break. You're a glorified dog catcher, elected to do a job. This is just the democratic version of the divine right of king. I am king, God appointed me. You must do everything I say, and I might give you a few crumbs off the royal table. I was elected, That makes me superior to all of my democratic fellow countrymen, and you must do what I say. Here's a crumb, right? Government spending, government favor, government subsidy, government protection, government regulation to benefit all the people who gave them votes on election day. It's the same corruption and nonsense. I wanted to make one more distinction, and that is, what type of rules should we have in the society? What kind of rules should we have in the society? There are two types of rules in which society can be organized, what are called end-independent and end-dependent rules. End-independent rules. Broadly speaking, end-independent rules are less concerned with the outcomes resulting from people's actions in society and more concerned with the procedures through which people interact in pursuit of their own individual ends. The perfect example of end-independent rules are the rules of the road. It does not matter why or for what reason individuals may be driving their car on the road. To go to work, to drive their kid to a soccer game, for an appointment with the dentist, to visit friends, whatever reason. As long as individuals abide by the rules, you make a full stop at a stop sign before proceeding across the intersection, you obey the posted speed limits, you're pulling over and stopping when an emergency vehicle is passing, etc. As long as they abide by these general rules, they are free to drive for whatever reason the individuals may have in mind. What's important is the procedural rules, not the outcomes as to why people are following the rules given the purposes they have in mind. The purpose for the rules of the road is to minimize conflicts. Cars going through an intersection at the same time in perpendicular directions, some cars driving on the right side while others are driving on the left side. Thus, with end-independent rules, the rules are procedural. They're concerned with the process, not the outcomes that result from people traveling on the road for their individual and different reasons. The same thing is why with the rules of a game, right? The rules of a game. You're playing some sport. As long as you stay within the boundary lines, don't tackle or interfere in a way that the rules don't permit, you're free to play design your strategies and work with your team members in any way you want. And even if one team wins 9 times out of 10, you might wish, have a sympathy for the underdog. Oh, he only won 1 game out of 10. Oh, that poor team. We would consider it a fair game because the rules are concerned with the procedures, not the outcomes. Contrasted to this are end-dependent rules. End-dependent rules, on the other hand, are more concerned with the outcome and less with the procedural process leading to that outcome, other than to assure that the outcome is reached in the form or pattern or result the government rulemaker desires. In economic policy, income distribution is constructed as an end-dependent set of rules. The tax system and the tax structure may be designed to assure a more equal distribution of income in society. A progressive income tax may have as one of its purposes to make it more difficult to earn and accumulate large amounts of wealth in society according to some implicit or explicit conception of a fair, reasonable, or just ranges of income in that society. The progressively taxed income of the wealthier in society may then be redistributed to those in lower income brackets to narrow the money-measured discrepancy between the notions of the rich and the poor. That's what an end-dependent... They don't care whether you earned it fairly, honestly, industriously, hardworkingly, better compared to some other guy. No, we want an outcome. With end-independent rules, individuals tend to be treated equally by the law, regardless of the social interactive outcomes for the individual members of the society. With these alternative end-dependent rules, individuals need to be treated unequally to assure the outcomes the economic policymaker wishes to have, regardless of the fairness or justness of the process that has led to the outcomes that the policymaker wishes to correct or change. Let me make a contrast here. A foot race, right? I talked about running a race before. A foot race. People line up, the gun goes off, and they go running. Some people are faster than others. Some are more hardworking than others. Some people are more determined to train and prepare. Some physically work out more than others, watch their diet more than others. Some try to develop a better psychological attitude of concentration for the race than others. And some people are just genetically, just can run better. All of these things, both nature and nurture. as the phrase goes. That's reality. Now, some people win races and some people don't because of all of these factors. But as long as you're running the race and you don't trip the person next to you or push him off the course, guess what? The race is the race. And we all would consider it fair. We all would consider it fair because the rules were followed and the outcome is whatever the outcome was. But now let us suppose that someone came along and said, you've been winning these races too often. This fellow, he should have a better chance to win. So we're not going to put weights on your ankles. Okay, we're going to put weights on your ankles. How will that affect the outcomes? Well, it will change it, won't it? Before it was everyone was treated equally. You do whatever training you've decided to do. You now get on the start line. The gun is shot, and everyone has the same start. You just run, and the outcomes are whatever they are. Now you want a certain outcome that you may consider more fair or equal. So now you have to treat people differently at the start line. Some people have their ankles free. Others, the government puts weights on the ankles to slow them down. One is concerned with the process. The other is trying to manipulate the process to assure an outcome that the regulators and planners and redistributors consider better than just leaving people alone. This was expressed by a famous economist named Karl Brunner, an article he wrote a while ago on the limits of economic policy, in which he used this game analogy. The difference between end-independent rules and end-dependent rules may be usefully explained with the metaphor of a football game. The policymakers would be represented by the commissioner of the football league, and the players represent agents in the socio-economic game. End-independent rules limit policymakers to formulate, monitor, and enforce the general rules controlling the detailed plays of the game. The umpires, was he inbounds or out of bounds? Was it a fair tackle or an unfair tackle? Was the line properly crossed to earn the point or not? Right? Just the procedural rules. The choice of strategies, tactical procedures, and all the very details of the play are left to the players themselves. You live your life the way you want, as long as you're in these general rules of the game. And dependent rules empower the commissioner to shape both the general rules and much detail of the play in a shifting pattern in accordance with the state of play. The end-independent rule approach to policy analysis thus understands policy not as a choice of specific actions, but as a choice of general rules usually embedded in a set of institutions. So what Brunner is saying here is that the free market institutions are you don't kill, you don't steal, and you don't cheat and defraud. And as long as you follow those general rules of the game, everyone is free to play as they wish, want, and are willing to try, with the outcomes whatever they are. Steve Jobs, by inventing various products with the Apple Corporation, made a lot more money than I'll ever make in a lifetime. He made less than a year more than I'll make in a lifetime. Who cares? I chose to be a professor. And given my abilities and competency, I'm paid the income and salary that others think my services are worth. Okay, I got an advanced degree. I chose to do this as opposed to going into a business profession where hypothetically maybe I could have earned more. I made that choice. So he made tens of millions, and I'll never make that in my entire life. Who cares? Why the hell does it bother people that he has more to spend? So what? Stop being envious. Just look at yourself. You want more? Do things that you think will earn you more. Are there costs to doing so? You have to go back to school. You have to learn new trades. And sometimes you have to deal with people who are just jerks. Right? Have you ever dealt with a jerk? Yeah. That's life too. You think there's ever going to be a world without jerks and idiots? Okay. We live in a world, if I can put it this way, who are always going to be racists. You going to get away from that? No. You think the world didn't have racists 2,000 years ago? You think they're racist study? There's going to be, if they assume that Earth is still revolving around in this human life, 2,000 years from now they'll still be racists and jerks. That's life. Now, what you can do is you can have rules of the road that minimize their ability to negatively affect you. No slavery, no special privileges for some at the expense of others. And just accept the fact that, take advantage of that, and just allow the idiots to be idiots and try to avoid them as best you can. And as the phrase goes, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never harm me. Now, of course, words hurt. And if you're a decent human being, you try not to intentionally say or do anything to offend somebody or hurt them. Okay, that's just being a decent human being. But at the bottom of the line, at the end of the day, the bottom line is, words cannot hurt you. Yeah, he wants to throw some phrase at you. That's life. My mother's family is Jewish. Do you think that they didn't have in the old country anti-Semitism? You think they weren't discriminated against and had anti-Jewish phrases thrown at them? Of course they did. Guess what? Who cares? They came to America. Is there private anti-Semitism in the United States? Not like in the past. But yeah, there are anti-Jewish people in the United States. But you know what? They're private people. You ignore them or you give them right back and tell them to shut their mouths and you walk on. But you see, the government doesn't have the power. It doesn't make such rules to discriminate. There's no anti-Jewish laws. Luckily, in my country, there's no longer anti-black laws anymore. Okay? And you just move on. You don't look at the past. You think of what I can do looking to the future. That's what my grandparents did when they came from Imperial Tsarist Russia to escape from anti-Jewish pogroms when they were little kids. And they were lucky and willing to make that risk and change so I could have the life I have as a freer person in the United States today. You want these general and independent rules, rather than rules that this individual is going to get this, but not that. This group is going to have this privilege, but not this group. That's the way to corruption and abuse. We want the free society so each individual can use his knowledge as best he thinks he can to improve himself to the benefit of others in the free market setting. Thank you very much. Okay, questions, comments, thoughts, ruminations. Oh, yes.
I think just about everybody in the room, I guess, and probably in most countries that we consider Western, would agree that a market-based system is probably the most efficient way to organize society. Although varying degrees of, say, government intervention would be suggested, right? Given the fact that in a capitalist society, accumulated capital accumulates more capital, and you end up potentially having a situation like Russia where you have an oligarchy owners, capital owners who basically run the country, along with, say, government. How do you in an unfettered system, how do you balance the rent-seeking of capital accumulators with the needs and wants of, say, the working population? And I think John Rawls had a good idea. That his theory was that everybody would believe in some level of fairness. If you got to choose where you were born, you wouldn't choose, say, Ethiopia, Kenya, or in the Middle East or something like that. You choose, say, what a Western democracy, say, the northern countries.
Right.
So obviously there's an inherent desire of people to have a good chance at succeeding in life.
Right.
But if you have a situation where an oligarchy can develop from your system, how do you balance that? How do you deal with that?
Well, that's the question is, what if you do in a situation where wealth has accumulated in the past, is still being accumulated, seems to be in few hands, sort of like that image of, those Russian oligarchs around Putin and things. The thing is that in the market, in an open competitive market, there's no guarantee of preserving and maintaining wealth. Now, why do I say that? There is an American magazine that maybe some of you have heard of, Fortune magazine. It's a business magazine. Okay, now, I don't know if your library has it here, but there are libraries that you could go to in the United States. Fortune magazine started being published, I think, in the mid-1920s. You could go into a library where they have the big old bound volumes of every issue. You could go back there and say, well, who were the Fortune 500, wealthiest people, biggest corporations in 1932? Then, like 10 years later, 1943, 10 years later, 1955, 10 years later, 1967. Okay, you see what I'm saying? Like every 10 years. And now compare who are the wealthiest people in the society, right? The Fortune 500 wealthiest people, and the Fortune 500 largest and wealthiest corporations. You know what you're going to see? They're not the same. To the degree the market is open and competitive to the new guy, the innovative guy. If the one who was able to satisfy the consumers yesterday and earn big bucks cannot do so the next day and the next day, the better fellow in the race of the marketplace overtakes him. And that's what is shown by looking at the pattern of wealth and resource and business ownership in the United States. See, the difficulty in a lot of this is that it's a snapshot. And by which I mean, by a snapshot, a frozen picture, rather than the motion picture that the frozen frame is taken from. Okay, let me give you an analogy. Suppose that you're shown a frozen frame out of a motion picture, and this frozen frame shows some guy just having come off the edge of a cliff and he's hanging in midair. Would that be considered a stable situation? Of course not. He's hanging in midair right off the edge of a cliff. Is this good or bad? You don't know. If it's an American Western movie, the Indians were chasing him, and they got him to the edge of the cliff and threw him off the cliff. Right, he's about to die down there. But could it not be another hypothetical scenario? The Indians were chasing him. He got to the edge of the cliff. He realized that if he stayed, they were going to kill him. He looked down, and there's a river down below, and it's a big, risky jump, but there's a chance that he could maybe dive in, and if the water is deep enough, survive the jump, and the current would take him, downstream to safety. So he jumped off the cliff in the frozen frame that you're seeing. That's his chance to live. You can't tell what this frozen frame means if you don't look at what went before and what comes after, right? You have to watch the movie. It's like coming in and turning on TV in the middle of a movie. What the hell's going on? It's hard to tell sometimes. Who are these people? What are they doing? That doesn't look nice. Yeah, see? Now, if you look at the market as a dynamic process, the way as from earlier today, Schumpeter saw it as a dynamic process of creative destruction. Mises as a consumer-driven but entrepreneurially guiding process in which the consumer ultimately determines who earns profits and who suffers losses. If you fail this test, wealth is constantly being redistributed by the market. The market makes some people rich and some people poor. And some people who are poor become rich. So the distribution of wealth is not something that's frozen and fixed like a picture, a frozen frame. It's a changing kaleidic pattern of successes and less successes, some failures. Also, when you see the data about income distribution, so many people are in this category, so many people are in that category. That's terrible. But it's not the same people through their life. You're young. You haven't even started your careers yet. Your individual income levels are pretty low, I assume. Then you're going to get a job, and you go into your high level income earning years, whatever that ends up being for your career track. And then when you get retired, it's going to go down again because you're living off your savings or other sources of income. It changes over time. If you have a country in which the population is heavily towards younger people with a relatively small older retired population, you're going to see a huge disparity in income categories because there's a lot of young people who haven't started their careers yet versus old people. If you have, some young people, but a lot of maximum earning power people in terms of their age categories, you're going to see a different distribution of income. So there's a dynamism to it that you have to look at it as a dynamic process, not a frozen frame out of a picture that takes a lot of things out of context. So I'm less concerned with that. I think that envy, either individual envy or social policy envy, is something that eats away at a society It can make a person bitter and angry and can destroy the character of a society in terms of how people view each other. As long as the guy has earned it honestly, the Steve Jobs guy, I assume Steve Jobs never stole from anybody. It's the impression I have from reading about him, right? He just made a damn computer and a phone. So he made a lot of money. Who cares? That's all that matters. I'm not envious of the professional athlete who's taller, more physically strong. It's hard to believe that there's, a better physique than mine, of course, but I'm still trying to persuade my wife of that. But anyway, the tall guy, very athletic, he's going to make it as a football player, as a basketball player. I'm never going to make it. So what? Why am I supposed to shake my fist at the heavens and say, God, why did you give me such a lousy body? That's life. You can't do anything about it. Okay. Any other questions?
Radio?
Oh, right there, yes.
Yeah. Well, with me, I know most countries in years gone by was comfortable with this communist way and keeping their citizens in line with them.
Right.
But now that we have felt the freedom of democracy,
Right.
I don't know why they want to bring about this social rule. Yeah.
The reason is that because it's the same mentality, I would argue. This is the socialism has been the extreme form, like in the Soviet Union or communist China under Mao. But the mentality is the same, the controlling mentality, the regulating mentality, the presumption that those in political power paternalistically know how people should live and what they should do better than the people themselves. That quote that I had from Adam Smith, you might remember, about the man of system who wants to move us about like pawns on the chessboard. Whether it be the moderate form of the welfare and interventionist state or the extreme form of like communism, it's the same mentality. They don't want to leave you alone to move about the chessboard you want, the way you want. I want to leave you alone. Be on the chessboard wherever you desire.
Like they say, with the welfare state,
Yes.
the way the world runs, it seems like we would always have that. So now with this social rule, I want to know if we'll be away from that.
Nothing is inevitable. Trends have changed in the past and they'll change again. If you could go back in a time machine to, let's say, 1900, and you ask people, well, what is the new 20th century going to be like, right, 1900? They would have said, well, there's industry, there's innovation, there's not been a major war in Europe, since Napoleon. We can only look forward to the 20th century of peace, prosperity, and more democracy. Well, what happened in the 20th century with 2 world wars? Now, on the other hand, then there were the people who were living in the 1930s. Oh my gosh, Hitler has come to power in Germany. Stalin is in the Soviet Union. Democracy is giving way to tyranny. The free society is over. Well, Hitler and Mussolini died in the ashes of World War II, and eventually, though decades later, the Soviet Union died as well. So democracy and freedom in that broad sense didn't die under the threat of Nazism or communism. So now we look at the world and we say, oh, the government does this, and there's political corruption of that type, and there's people's attitudes about this. How can we ever change this? Trends change, and they do, in ways that are often very unpredictable. All I can say is that what's most important in pursuit of this is that if you do believe in freedom, in the form that I have been talking about, and you believe that it is right and just and good and moral as a way that people should live, then your first calling is to defend and articulate it, even if the times seem not likely to bring it to fruition in any immediate sense. Let me give a story. There was a person with my kind of ideas named Albert J. Nock. He lived in the first half of the 20th century. And he once wrote a little essay called Isaiah's Job, taking off the theme from the Bible, Isaiah in the Bible. And so he told the story, a lot of people get dissuaded, and remember, he's writing in the 1930s. So, Nazism and communism, freedom seems to be losing. What's the point of even trying to fight it? So they told Isaiah's job. Now, who's Isaiah? Isaiah was this guy in the Bible that God calls upon to preach to his people. Turn away from sin, follow God's laws, be righteous. And Isaiah's getting frustrated because every time that he goes out to preach to the people either don't listen or they listen and then go back to their sinful ways. So finally Isaiah says, God, why have you put me on this mission, right? Why have you put me on this mission? I keep trying to preach people righteousness, live in God's law, and everybody's sinning in their various ways. And so, according to the story, God speaks to Isaiah and says, it's not your job whether you think people are hearing or not. You can't look into people's minds or souls. All you can do is what I've told you is the right thing to do, to preach righteousness. What it leads to is my job, not yours. Okay? We can't control the world. All we can do is take responsibility for ourselves. And that includes that if you believe in a set of ideas of right and wrong, better, in these kind of political and economic senses in this context, all you could do is to try to understand them, articulate them to the best of your ability, and share them with others to maybe move the society in a different direction. How it will, whether it will, when it will, you can never know that because the future is unpredictable. All you can do is what you think is right. That's what I do. But of course, at the same time, my wife says, stop doing what's right. Take out the garbage, walk the dog. Keeps getting me down to these other things.
Looking at this social rule again for
Yes.
the world, it would make sure that the rulers would only look at your basic needs. As far as these schools and educating your children, that wouldn't be a problem for them. That'll be a problem for the farmers.
Well, the thing is that what is a proper standard of living? What is a good education? What is a reasonable social environment? People have various views about this. When the government taxes our wealth and uses that wealth to then impose their conceptions of good, better, right, comfortable, desirable, then it straitjackets all of us into their conception of these things. We're always going to live in a world that's less than perfect, okay? And we're always going to live in a world where we make mistakes. I know I make mistakes. And do you know how I know how I know I make mistakes? My wife reminds me every day. Unendingly, yeah. I love you, dear. Calm down. Anyway, but this is reality. All we can do is try to live the best way we can, articulating and expressing the ideas that we think are right. And then we'll see how history plays out, because history follows paths that no one can really predict. Okay, is that about it? Thank you. And I thank you for being here. In the way that I talked about earlier, time is a scarce resource. You could have done other things today with this time, but for one reason or another, you chose to be here with me. Thank you. And hopefully, if your schedules permit, same time, same place tomorrow. Okay, thank you.